Okay, I think he's ready. Everybody got a seat? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Governor Scott Walker. Welcome.
Glad to be here. Good to be back in New Hampshire.
Yeah,
Thanks for sticking around all day. Appreciate it.
This is a dedicated group.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to reopen the summit. We've all just had our lunch. We're relaxed again. Everybody is here.
So you got your steps in or your Fitbit, right? Getting all ready for all this?
All these people turned out because they care deeply about education and public education in this country and want to see things get better. So let me ask you to do what I've done with most of the candidates, which is to start off by defining the problem as you see it. Is K through 12 education in America in crisis?
Yes. First of all, let me say, not just as a governor or candidate for president, as a parent, as an uncle. I've got two kids now who are 20 and 21, both went through public schools in Wauwatosa. I've got two nieces who are in elementary school in Waukesha, Wisconsin. I just care about that from a moral imperative, but it's also an economic imperative. I just fundamentally believe that every child deserves access to a great education. Be it no matter what zip code they live in, no matter what their background, what their parents do for a living, every child deserves access to great education. And it may very well be in a traditional public school, it may be in a charter school, a choice school, a home school, a virtual school, a religious school, you name it. Every child deserves access to great education. And the biggest barrier, or the biggest challenge right now, I should say, is the barriers that are in place. There are a lot of great schools, and they come in many different ways, in many different forms. Many of them are traditional public settings, but there are also many others out there that are failing. And to me, it's the barriers of Washington and the regulations that the federal government puts on to states and local school districts. It's teachers' unions, a lot of great teachers out there, but a lot of those unions are barriers to sorting out between who are the exceptional teachers and how do you reward them versus maybe the one or two in each school that are doing a poor job. And all too often the teachers' unions are about protecting them. It's the barriers in terms of even having funding. You don't have to have the most funding, but having funding that actually goes into the classroom as opposed to the overall education bureaucracy. It's tearing down those barriers one after another after another.
What specifically, just while we're on barriers, what have been the biggest challenges? And I know we're going to talk about your infamous war with the union in a minute, but just in more generally, bring it down to the local level, what have you had to deal with in Wisconsin?
Well, I mean, clearly, we'll touch on it, the barriers you get in terms of the union contracts we had before were huge barriers in terms of both rewarding the great teachers and maybe challenging those that aren't so good. But I also think at the federal level, a lot of the talk about No Child Left Behind, some of the other federal regulations, a lot of times, even when people talk about things like Common Core and others, I'm sure we'll talk about later, all too often it's way, and really, my opinion has been both as a parent and now as a governor, as elected official before that our greatest asset that we have in education is the wonderful teachers that are out there. The more we can let them do what they got into teaching to do in the first place, what they love to do, and help those children, the better off we are. But all too often, schools, school districts, states, and the federal government put in place all these barriers, all these regulations, all these new standards that often get in the way of doing the good work they were trained to do.
Let's get into things that you've worked on as governor. Wisconsin has been on the forefront of school choice. Mm-hmm. You've had a voucher program in Milwaukee since 1991, before you became governor. Yeah. Kind of start there maybe, and assess what's working well, what you wish you could do more of, and what maybe hasn't worked and what you've learned from.
Well, hat tip to my friend, former Governor Tommy Thompson, was one of the great champions, a handful of others like him around the country. You think about State Representative Polly Williams, who I later served with in Wisconsin, was a courageous woman who's now since passed, but who led the charge in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, wanting to make sure that children in her district, an inner city district, had more educational opportunities, more chances out there. She worked along with a lot of other great champions, Dr. Howard Fuller and others. The program started in Milwaukee in the early 1990s. I was proud to be in the legislature in the mid-1990s when we expanded it, so it wasn't just choice schools without a religious affiliation, that we expanded it to include those that included a religious affiliation. and it's been tremendously successful. But throughout the years, my predecessor and some of the others involved in the legislature at the time, before I was governor, tried to put a lot of barriers on, tried to slow the program down. It went through some real challenges in the 7 or 8 years before I was governor. When we came in, we lifted the caps. In fact, we changed things in Milwaukee. There had been an income cap, so it was just low-income families. We expanded it because we thought one of the great things to have a vibrant city like Milwaukee is to have a vibrant middle class, and one of the best ways to do that is to give those families more educational opportunities. It was great for low-income families, but we found a lot of middle-class families. Maybe dad was a firefighter, mom was a nurse at the local community hospital, had a few kids, and they didn't like the public school nearby, but it was too costly for them to send their kids to the private school, so they ended up moving out to the suburbs where they could afford to send them. Well, we want families like that to be in our urban areas, not just in Milwaukee, but across the country. So we expanded the income levels, we expanded the number of kids that could be in the Milwaukee Parental School Choice Program. We lifted the number of schools that could be in, and then we took it further. We went to the adjoining city in Racine nearby, and in the last couple of years, we've been proud to expand it statewide. As I know now, another number of other governors and lawmakers have around the country. For us, that's something we feel very positive about, not just for what it means in those choice schools, for those families with the vouchers, but because in the end, it puts the pressure on the traditional public schools, like the ones where my kids went to school, to use our reforms that we gave the schools a few years ago to actually up their game as well. And so it's not a win-lose scenario. It's one where as you lift kids up and you give families more educational opportunities, it doesn't just help the students at those choice schools or charter schools. It helps the kids at the traditional public schools and other schools, because with competition brings the opportunity to do better at many different levels.
Now, do you believe that that's been the case, that
Yeah.
having sort of such a broad-based approach and giving people so many choices, that it has helped traditional public schools?
Well, there's been a number of different studies out there, but I think one of the best things is twofold. One, certainly if you look at the surveys of parents and how they feel about their kids at college, or their kids' K through 12 education. I'm going to say college, I'm used to having 2 kids in college now, but their K through 12 education, overwhelming numbers talk about the satisfaction levels they have with their choice option if they took it. But I also think as many different options, not just with choice schools, it's with more charter schools, it's even with public school choice. All those things put the pressure. A lot of people don't know this, but what we did with, sometimes referred to as Act 10, the big reforms that got me all sorts of attention a few years ago, mainly because I had about 100,000 protesters come and occupy my state capitol, wasn't just about unions, it wasn't about collective bargaining, it wasn't just about pensions and health care contributions. Those are all part of it. It was really about education reform.
Be specific about that.
Yeah,
Go into that.
because in our case, it's interesting. By changing collective bargaining, in our state right now, our schools, you talk about charter schools, we've talked about this before in New York. Some of the reasons why charter schools are successful is they get around some of the nuances that are difficult with contracts that are in place. In our state, effectively every public school can be a charter school. That's because we changed collective bargaining so that schools now, and the people that taxpayers actually elect to run those schools, the school board members and the superintendents and principals that they select to run the district and then run their individual schools, they can actually go out and hire and fire based on merit. There's no seniority or tenure. They can hire and fire based on merit. They can pay based on performance. That means they can put the best and the brightest in our classrooms, and they can reward those who do exceptionally well. One of the great joys I've had over the last couple of years is I tour public schools in my state. As I go into a school, and I can usually tell a teacher who's somewhat supportive of what I've done, because they lean into me, they look both ways, they whisper, "Thank you," but because they knew the one or two, not many, I'm not casting a broad net here, but the one or two teachers who just really weren't cutting it at that school, and they were frustrated because all the good teachers know, whether you're a first-term teacher or you've been there 25 years, they know who steps up and does a good job, and they know the couple that don't. And since our reforms, the couple that don't aren't there anymore, because the principals can actually say maybe it's time to move on to a different profession, and those schools and those districts in many cases have been able to reward those doing exceptionally good work. And so that's helped us out. Where the school choice expansion in our state helped as well is that a vast majority of our districts used our reforms. That's why for all the hype 4 years ago with the protesters about how the world was going to come to an end, how public education was going to be devastated because of what we did in Wisconsin, I'm proud to say 4 years later, graduation rates are higher, third grade reading scores are up, ACT scores are now second best in the country in my state. That just goes to show that reforms can work. And what helped us with not just improving our traditional public schools, but upping the game in the number of charters that we have, expanding school choice statewide, even making it easier for homeschool families, all those things helped because the handful of school districts that hadn't fully embraced what we provided in our reforms now feel a little pressure. They now know there are other options out there, there are other opportunities, and that's really the end game. Again, I've got 2 kids who proudly went through public schools in Wauwatosa, where our home is. I've got 2 nieces who are 2 in elementary schools right now. I want all of our kids to do well. I want every child to have access to a great education, and there are many ways to do that.
So, go back to the sort of the beginning of your war with the unions.
Yeah.
You said the teachers who supported you were sort of whispering in your ear that they supported you. How intense was it? And looking back on it to where you are now, do you think that you could work with the teachers unions going forward? Do you think there's a, or would you, if elected, do you think the teachers unions need to be broken? How do you approach it?
Well, I want to be clear. I have great admiration for teachers. I went to public schools. My kids went to public schools. I think there are overwhelming, vast majority of teachers in America, be they at a public school, a charter school, a choice school, are excellent. They're doing a great job. I'm so appreciative of the good work that they've done. And so I want to make it clear, when I take on battles with the teachers' union bosses, it wasn't for the teachers. In fact, I remember at one point, we had, because of our reforms, we had over 100,000 protesters, literally. You think about the Occupy movement, it didn't start on Wall Street. It started on my street in Madison, Wisconsin. It started in terms of our capital, literally overtaking our state capital. And I believe part of the reason why the groups from D.C., not just the local folks, but the groups from D.C. started busing in, flying in, chartering in, big groups of protesters, not only from NEA, who came there, their national president, but the AFL-CIO and AFSCME and others out there, was because the real threat for them wasn't about their members, it was about the money. You see, as part of what we did, thank you, I appreciate that. And it was about not the money spent in the classroom, it was about their money, or what they thought was their money. You see, in the end, what really drove them crazy was the fact, and it was pretty revealing, because at one point, 2 of the statewide union heads announced publicly, and I still remember being on one of the Sunday morning shows where I had to explain 3 or 4 times to the moderator why this was just a red herring, and that was 2 of these statewide union presidents, one from the teachers union, one from one of the other unions, said, "Oh, we'll give you the pension and health care contributions." What I asked for was pretty reasonable. We were getting people to match their pension contribution, which is just over 5%, and to make a health insurance premium of just over 12%, almost 13%. In my state, most people outside of government are paying 20 to 25% or more of their health insurance premium, and most people are matching if they have a pension or they're making a significant contribution to their 401k. I remember my brother, who's a banquet manager and a part-time bartender, his wife works at a department store. They said, "Hey, I'd love to have the deal you're offering." They said, "I'm paying $700 a month for my 401k and the little bit I can set aside, for my pension, or excuse me, for my premium, health insurance premium, and the little bit I can set aside in my 401k. I'd love to have your deal." So what we were asking for was pretty reasonable. But I remember early on in that debate, these 2 statewide presidents or leaders of the unions said, "Well, we'll give you that." What they didn't realize is, one, they didn't have any authority to do that. Anyone who's dealt with local school districts knows that contracts are not negotiated statewide, they're negotiated by district. And all the while they were telling the press this, a whole bunch of union leaders were running to their school districts trying to cram through contracts to get in before our law went into effect. Really, the reason why they were doing it was trying to buy time, because what they feared the most was that we also gave teachers and other public employees the freedom to choose whether they wanted to be in a teachers union or not, or any other public union. And what they feared is, without automatic union dues deductions, that the teacher in Milwaukee who's paying $1,400 for her union dues might say, "You know what? I don't need the union. I can work perfectly fine with my principal. I can work with my other teachers out there. I don't need to spend that kind of money on union dues. I'm going to keep that for my kids' college education or for whatever else I want to do for my family." And that's what they feared the most, which is why they sent so many people in there. Why we had all the protests, why I had death threats, why my family was targeted, why lawmakers were targeted, why we went through the recall. Frankly, why I had protesters the other day at the Iowa State Fair, because they know I'm not intimidated. I'm not intimidated from their attacks or from any others out there. I'm going to do what's right for the people of my state, including the children of my state, just like I'm going to do that nationally. There's a lot of great Republicans. You've heard from some today. You're going to hear from some in a little bit. What makes us unique is we fought those fights, and we won those fights, and we actually got results, and we did it without compromising our common sense conservative principles. And that's what they fear the most, is it's not just someone who can talk the talk, but someone who can actually deliver on it. That's why they brought all these people in. That's why they brought in all the protests. That's why they didn't just go after me. The NEA went after me, and all the other groups went after me in the recall. But they made me the #1 target again last year. Why? Because I threatened them. I threatened them because I actually care about getting things done, not just about talking about them. And I think that's part of the reason why you see so much interest from Washington in this race, and even in going after us the other day.
You've also done reforms on things like teacher tenure.
Yeah.
How impactful do you think those type of things have been in the traditional public schools?
Well, I think it's a big deal. And again, that's part of what we did. We lifted all, by changing collective bargaining, something I'd love to let you do in New York and others do across the country, because you listen to the union bosses and they would say, oh, this is an affront or threat to every teacher. That's just baloney. That's just nonsense. Again, I can always remember my kids. I remember a few years ago, one of my son's parent-teacher conferences, I was watching one of his teachers who'd been there for 25 years, and it was amazing to me to watch him talk about Matt through his English class and what he was into and what he was reading. And this guy was like he'd just come out of school. He was so excited. And then I remember there was somebody else who'd been there about the same amount of time who had, as we joked, and others had joked about, had retired, he hadn't left the building yet. He was already kind of checked out, and there was a real difference there. And under the old collective bargaining system, under the old contracts, you can't distinguish between the two. Probably the best example why this is important is back in 2010. In 2010, a year before I was elected governor, or a year before I took office, I should say, as governor, and that spring, there was a young woman by the name of Megan Sampson, who was a first-year English teacher in the city of Milwaukee. Now, Megan Sampson was this great teacher, did well with her kids, brought parents into the equation, worked well with her fellow teachers, and she did so well that the English Teachers Council in Wisconsin named her the Outstanding Teacher of the Year. A great teacher anywhere in the state, but here she was in the biggest city, in the largest urban district in the state of Wisconsin. Great recognition for her. A couple weeks later, you know what she found out? She'd been laid off. She'd been laid off. Why? Because even before Republicans took control of state government, something Gail Collins and some of the folks in the New York Times need to remember when they write columns, trashing me on things like this, because that was a year before I took office. Even then, when times were tough with the economy, the Democrats in charge of state government reduced aid to local governments, including school districts. And what do school districts do when they're locked into old contracts? They have to lay people off. And how did they lay them off? The last hired is the first fired. The last in is the first out. So who was one of the first people to be laid off? Megan Sampson. The teacher, the outstanding new English teacher of the year, was one of the first people to be laid off. Now, as just everyday citizens, you look at that and you think, that's absurd. That's crazy. That doesn't make any sense. One of your best teachers in one of the districts that desperately needs great teachers, you're laying her off. Well, that's what happened under the old collective bargaining union contracts. That's who they look out for. That's not a whole lot of solidarity out there, taking one of your best out there. So one of my mistakes, you talk about lessons learned, one of the big mistakes I made coming in as governor, hands down, I'll tell you this, I wrote about it in my book on Intimidated. People were shocked I actually admitted mistakes, because politicians never say that. But I said I was so eager to fix things, I didn't talk about it. Because most politicians just talk about things and never fix them. So if I had to err, I guess I'd rather err on the side of fixing things. But what I learned since then is you got to do both. You got to talk about it and you got to fix it. Don't use talk as an excuse not to act, but don't forget to explain why you're doing it. When I started telling the story of people like Megan Sampson, people in my state said, that's not right. That's not right. They didn't just say that was a policy difference. They said that's a moral problem. I'm proud to say in our state today, because of our reforms, because of the changes we made that brought in all those protesters, people like Megan Sampson will never be laid off again. Because we have said school districts can make sure that they're able to protect the best and the brightest, to reward them in the classroom, to make sure that even when times are tough, those are the people they get to ultimately preserve, because they're the ones having the greatest impact on the students in the classroom. That's something we need to do all across the country, not just in my state, but everywhere else across America. Because, again, we got some great teachers out there, but we've also got some scenarios where it's just not working well. What we've also found, the other interesting thing is, when we did this, it was like a weight was lifted, in the sense that a lot of folks who'd gotten into teaching for the right reasons in the first place suddenly didn't have to worry about a union contract that dictated what the temperature was in the teacher's lounge or how many whiteboards there were up there, but instead actually got to collaborate with their principal and other teachers and actually find out, what are we going to do in the classroom? What kind of impact are we going to have? They started worrying less about the union contracts and more about the classroom, which is what got them into education in the first place. It was very liberating, and I'd love to see that happen all across America. Because again, I'm a huge advocate for school choice. I think it's a tremendous opportunity, particularly for low-income and middle-class families across this great country. But I want to make sure every child does well. Not just because it's a moral imperative, because I know economically, if we're going to compete in the global world that we live in today, we got to make sure that every one of our children, every student that comes out of any of our schools, be it public, charter, choice, virtual, religious, or comes out of a homeschool environment, every one of those children have got to be in a position to succeed in careers that are going to drive our economy going forward. And so it's both an economic and a moral imperative.
Let's shift gears. Federal government.
Yeah.
Let's start with Common Core.
Yeah.
You were an early supporter of Common Core. You authorized spending to get it implemented in your state. What happened? When did you change your position?
Yeah, in our case, it was a part of what was in place before we came in 2010 when I ran for governor. It wasn't even on our radar. We didn't talk about it in the 2010 election. It was not something I and most people were even hearing about at the time.
It wasn't controversial then.
No, it wasn't.
So
well, that's probably why I did. Well, part of it is as often is the case, even though it's not a federal law, as the Federal Department of Education started getting involved with some of the funding issues and things of that nature, is as often the case, which I'll get to in a minute for my solution for that overall, but it started changing things. And in our state, what happened was an issue that hadn't been on our radar was something that a number of parents, teachers, activists, and others came to us a couple years ago, about 2.5 years ago, and started talking about their concerns. And we'd hold sessions around the state, we'd listen to people, we'd talk to people, and started looking into it, something that had been enacted before I got there. And said, well, yeah, they have some legitimate concerns. Now, there were some things that went further that we checked into that weren't as some raised, but by and large, the concerns that people raised, we thought were legitimate. I've said all along, to me, the best decisions, I think, when it comes to education are made in the home and ultimately in the school. And so the closer we could get to that, the better. And part of my concern after talking to folks was that this was taking some of those decisions away from people at the local level, from parents, from teachers and others, and instead driving those from outside of our state in particular. So what we did is we put it in our budget language. We actually originally drafted language that didn't get through the legislature. Then we put in my budget language that removes the requirement for any school district in the state of Wisconsin to have to abide by or live under Common Core standards. And we took away the funding for what's called the Smarter Balance Test so that it wasn't directly tied into something dictated by the Common Core standards, and said it's up to local school districts. Now, I want high standards. I bragged before about how Wisconsin still has the second highest ACT scores in the country, even after all of our reforms. So I want high standards. I just want them set by people at the local level, by people who have to be accountable, school board members that have to be accountable to parents and teachers and citizens right back in their own communities.
But let me press you on this a little bit, because here's kind of where it becomes a challenge is you're not governor of Wisconsin anymore, you're president of the United States, let's say, and now you're responsible for every child in this country, and you're responsible for holding other governors accountable, to make sure that those promises of high standards by the states actually come true, and that they do raise standards. So the accountability piece, how do you do that?
Well, I'll challenge that premise.
Okay.
I don't think the president of the United States is responsible to hold the governors accountable. I think the people are responsible for holding the governors accountable. And by that, that's a good, and I know others have different opinions, but that's just a philosophical belief of mine, is that the federal government should not be, nor is it in a very good place, it doesn't have a very good track record of that either, of holding anybody accountable. When you look at not just education, but the VA and IRS and all these other places out there, the federal government's the last place in the world I want holding state and local school districts accountable. To me, part of the problem is I would inverse it and say, my solution, in terms of and I've talked about this for some time, not just at education summits, I believe not only in education, but in other areas, I would like to take the money and the power from Washington in education, take the money and the power and send it back to the states, which ultimately get back to the schools. Because if you think about this mix, it's really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The federal government gives you a fraction of the money that we spend on public education in this country. Most of it comes either from states or from local property taxpayers. Some combination, it varies state by state. Some have more, some have less in terms of the state versus the property tax. But the vast, vast majority of money spent on traditional public education comes from a mix of state and local property tax funds. The federal government sends very little money down, but it has a disproportionately large impact in terms of the regulations that come with that money. So we're always jumping through hoops and hurdles to get a fraction of that money and doing things that may not, in any way, not just with Common Core, but with other things, that may not be aligned with what the expectations are of people within those states and particularly within those individual school districts. So to me, the best answer, if you want accountability, is send the money and the power back to the states. It's the same reason why I'm a great advocate for school choice. If you have comparable and if you have objective and comparable standards by which parents can look and say, if my kid goes to this school versus that school versus that school, and you don't dictate who gets to determine whether that's good or bad, you actually trust the parents to make the right decision. As long as those parents have access to good information about what those schools are doing, then I trust parents to make the right decision. I'll give you a good example of this. A couple years ago, we expanded school choice the first time statewide. We had a cap, so it's slowly grown. I had a mom I met last fall from Appleton, Wisconsin, a woman by the name of Dana. She came up to me and told me how, with tears in her eyes, how she had two kids who were still in school. She had two older kids, but two kids who were in school, one of which was her son. Her son had gone to a traditional public school in Appleton. She was very careful not to belittle the public schools. She said overall they were good, but for her son, that school that they were at was not the right school. Her son was doing poorly in school. His test scores were down. He was being bullied. He felt bad about his situation. He didn't like school at all. And so that mother took advantage of our expansion of school choice outside of Milwaukee and Racine and was one of the first vouchers outside of that traditional area to go and use it in the Fox Valley. Well, she came up to me last fall. She first came up to our Lieutenant Governor, Rebecca Clayfish, and told me the story, and I went and found her myself because she was worried that my opponent was going to get rid of that program. She was shaking. She had tears in her eyes. She was worried that it was going to go away if I didn't continue to be the governor. The story she told me was so moving. It's the reason why the heart of the things we're doing here. She said, I just want to tell you how grateful I am for that voucher. Because my son, who is low in his grades, low in his test scores, has seen his scores more than double. He's doing well in school. He's in the band. He joined the football team. He loves school now. This was the right choice for my family. To me, it's not, I loved her attitude. She was not saying that public schools are bad. She just said for her son and their family, that was not the right place for him for whatever different circumstances out there. And so my view overall is we need to make sure that we provide parents as many great educational opportunities as possible. And we need to lift them all up. And so to me, the ultimate level of accountability goes right down to the household and saying parents are the best places to hold schools accountable as long as we give them plenty of information to go and make the best educated choice for their children.
So what do you see your role as president then? I mean, clearly you care deeply about this issue. You're passionate about it. You've spent a lot of time working on it. If elected president, how do you ensure that the issue stays front and center and that you are convincing the country that we have to prepare our kids for this 21st century economy?
Well, a combination of things. Certainly making that sort of move early on is going to take, I talked about not just doing it, but talking about it. It's going to take a fair amount of conversation, not only with the Congress, but with the American people, both in this campaign and after taking office, because that's not something you can do with an executive order. As much as this president has moved the line on executive orders, I actually still believe in the Constitution, so that's something you'd have to do with the Congress and with the states to make that sort of a transition. But I believe that's part of the discussion we want to have. I always tell folks, there's a lot of talk in Washington about different ways to explain things. I tell people the best way to explain it is right here. Where would you rather spend this dollar? Would you rather send it to Washington, where they skim money off the top, spend it in the bureaucracy just kitty corner from the United States Capitol and the Department of Education, or whether you do that, or what's the better alternative? Would you rather just keep it in your own home state so it can be spent on your kid's school? I think most Americans, Republican, Democrat, or somewhere in between, would rather keep that dollar right in their own state so it can stay closer to their child's school. And that's really what we're talking about. To me, that would be part of the discussion out there. Is you can be a great advocate for higher standards, for excelling, for doing more in education without having to have all the power. In fact, I think one of the mistakes is sometimes in government, those that think they have all the power are doing some of the least good for actually helping people in the schools, as opposed to unleashing that power out to the schools and saying, let's talk about those high standards. Let's talk about, I mean, really about competition. Now, if we laid out and we said, okay, this state, and as president and as leaders in the president's administration talking about, here's a state that's doing something really amazing, and here's another state that's doing something really amazing. I mean, that's the concept of what our founders thought about when they thought about the great republic that we live in. That you empower the states to go out and be the innovators, the ones that are pushing the edge to do the most dynamic, exciting things. I mean, I know probably a lot of you already. I just got in here. I was in from Minneapolis earlier talking about yesterday innovations in healthcare and repealing Obamacare, but you probably have talked about some of this. But to me, I think there's a needed discussion in this country, not just about where the money comes from, but about what are the best methods to provide education for the future. I've got two sons, as I mentioned now, who are 20 and 21. I think about how much differently they learned than I did. But I look at my nieces who are still in elementary school. My youngest is 8 years old. I think about Eva. In fact, she was on our Winnebago a couple weeks ago as we were traveling around Iowa, and we were playing this game on her iPad. And I just thought about how different even her education is, even than Matt and Alex's a few years later. And this idea that we still learn the same way that our parents and our grandparents did, where everybody at the same age sits in the same classroom and learns essentially the same thing, those are all things we need to challenge. And I think in this world of technology and innovation, again, the more you can get it back to the state and the local level, the better off we're going to be.
We've talked about that a lot today, so let me let you expand on that a little bit, the innovation piece. You know, are there schools, you know, specifically that you think are doing really interesting things, or to, you know, kind of paint a picture, if you will, of what the classroom of the future might look like for your grandkids?
Which hopefully is not too soon, because my kids are still junior and senior year of college, and they're not married yet and don't have a job, so I hope they do it in the right order there. But I do have a grandnephew, actually thinking about that, little Jonas, who's 5, and actually one of the most amazing things in that issue, he's 5, he lives in Phoenix, Arizona with my nephew and my nephew's wife, and we talk to him frequently. How? On my iPhone with FaceTime. In fact, it was kind of cute a couple years ago when I first became governor. We were, when all the protests and that were going on, all this attention. I remember one Sunday I was on the Sunday morning show, and my nephew must have had the TV on, and Jonas was so used to, back then it was Skype, now it's FaceTime, was so used to talking to me every so often on FaceTime and blowing kisses and that I was on one of those Sunday morning shows, and Jonas ran up to the TV and started blowing kisses, and then it went to the moderator, and he kept looking back at his dad like, where's Uncle Scott? Why isn't he blowing kisses back at me? But he's 5. And you think about that, or I think about my sons, tying a tie. My son Matthew can tie a bow tie much better than I can, not because I taught him, because he learned it on YouTube. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And you think about how technology, just in the last few years, has changed. I've got a reading buddy at a school called Bruce Guadalupe School in Milwaukee. Every year I get lined up with a 3rd grader and read with him or her. And just in the last few years, watching at that school and others like them, it's not just about reading, then they go over and do things on the computer where they interact and they're learning. There's just so many new ways to learn that even a few years ago we hadn't thought about. That's why this idea, this one-size-fits-all mentality out of Washington, particularly out of Washington, when you think about how far behind Washington is, that's the last place. We've got great places that deal with technology innovation. They're not, by and far, they're not in our nation's capital. We need to get them out to where people are leading the charge, and then allow that kind of competition to have state by state, school by school, community by community.
Do you have anyone in mind for Secretary of Education? And obviously, you're probably not going to announce that today. But who do you listen to? Who influences your thinking around education policy? Who's inspired you to take on some of these fights?
Well, and you're right, I won't announce, as we get closer, as I did for governor, I announced with each of my cabinet positions 3 or 4 people. Actually, a little known fact, by law, you cannot, by law, commit to anybody for a cabinet position. So most candidates don't know that. So you can't tell people in advance of the election that they have a position, but you can tell people the kind of people you'd be looking at. I'll do that for all different cabinet positions, just as I did for governor years ago, closer to the election. But it's a long list of folks. There are folks I've looked at even in my own state. Certainly over the years, I admired Dr. Howard Fuller, who was a leader, was a superintendent, who now works at Marquette University, has been a leader in that. Betsy, you had up before. We've worked with her and her team on a lot of issues. We worked with others around the country. But everywhere we go, one of the great things is I get introduced to people who've got new ideas, new innovations, and that's part of the reason why, to me, I realize Washington shouldn't be the sole place that gets to determine who are the leaders out there when it comes to education innovation. They're happening every day in classrooms and communities all across America. What we want to do is unleash that potential and free people up to go out and be accountable, but be accountable to the people in your communities and most importantly to the parents in your schools.
Tell us about a teacher. You've talked a lot about teachers earlier, but if there's one in particular, I just want you to get personal for a second. If there's someone in your life, a teacher who particularly influenced you or inspired you?
Yeah, it's kind of
and why, so that we can try to understand if it's something that is applicable in a bigger way.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of fun. A couple weeks ago, when we were in that same Winnebago I talked about in Iowa, I grew up in Wisconsin, but before I was in 3rd grade, from 1970 to 77, I lived in Plainfield, Iowa, small little town, about 450 people. It was one of those where if you close your eyes for a second, you've gone through it, but a great town. And I was back there on the campaign trail with my family. My parents came along that day, and we saw Betty Balsley, who was my 3rd grade elementary school teacher. In fact, it was kind of neat. She and her husband, Larry, were there. They had been members of our church in that small little town. And in a way, for her, actually, it ties into the church, because I think for her, part of her living her faith was how she was a teacher, that she really cared for me and for the other students that were part of her class in the many years after I was long gone. But she really showed this just kind of emotional attachment, which is really important in elementary school, because part of your love, I think, for education doesn't just come from the education itself. It comes from the warmth that you feel from the teacher in the classroom, the connection that a student has with the teacher, and that feeling that I like school because I like my teacher, I feel good about school, I feel good about myself. And that's what Mrs. Balsley gave to me, and I think to other students out there. And then in doing that, then it offered her the opportunity to inspire us, not just to want to do better in school, but in turn to want to do better in life. Not just to do better on a test or an exam or in social study, or excuse me, on homework, but to ultimately want to do better in life. And I think back to her all the way back to 3rd grade, but there were plenty of other great teachers in Delavan, where I then moved on, in middle school and high school, and I've seen a lot with my own kids. In fact, excuse me, the irony of that story I told you before about Megan Sampson is, even though she got laid off in Milwaukee, not long after my reforms, the Wauwatosa School District, where my kids grew up in, graduated from, used my reforms and had some room to hire some teachers. And one of the teachers they hired was Megan Sampson. And my son Alex's senior year, she was his English teacher. And I did a parent-teacher conference with her, and she was everything that you'd think. She was a wonderful, never talked a thing about politics or about me, just talked about how Alex was doing, and was exactly the kind of great teacher you'd expect. And so that just reaffirmed to me. I remember a couple years ago, I told our principal at Wauwatosa East High School, Nick Hughes, how appreciative I was to him and to the other teachers, because even though I knew, obviously, a lot of the folks there politically probably didn't agree with everything I did or how I did it, they never let it interfere with my sons, Matt and Alex. They were always good and decent to them. They always looked, in fact, Mr. Hughes always was looking out. One point, Michael Moore, the infamous movie maker, if that's what you want to call it, encouraged kids to walk out of school on a Friday afternoon. And Mr. Hughes, the principal, actually went in and found one of my kids and brought him into his office so that my son wouldn't have to see it. He was worried out of a high school of 1,100 that maybe a bunch of kids would walk off. As it was, about 15 walked off. And I think my son Alex said about only 5 of them really knew why. The other 10 thought they were just getting off of school. But he said that the amazing thing is he walked out of out of Mr. Hughes' office, and a bunch of their friends had made a sign that showed that they all signed, hundreds of them signed, that said they supported my sons, Matt and Alex. And I said that was just that kind of mindset, that no matter what they thought about me politically, that to me embodies a great teacher, and in this case a great principal, was somebody who cares about the kids no matter what their politics, no matter what their background. They're always in it for the kids. And to me, that's what makes a great teacher.
We talked a lot earlier about the federal stuff, but I didn't ask you about the debate that's happening in Washington right now around the big federal legislation, ESEA reauthorization, or the update of No Child Left Behind. What do you think about it? What's good about it, or what's bad? I mean, there's probably a lot you think bad about it, but they're making a lot of revisions. What do you think will come out of that? What do you want to have come out of that?
Well, I appreciate the interest behind it, all the way back to President Bush years ago and that, but I just got to tell you, even with the best of intentions, I talked before about barriers. The more barriers you put in front of education at the state and the local level, the more challenges are out there. And the best of intentions always bleed into something else out there. And that's why, for me, just fundamentally, my answer to that is, I think we're much better off if the money, and the resources, and the responsibilities for education go back to the state and the local level. It doesn't mean the president shouldn't use the bully pulpit, doesn't mean that we shouldn't be speaking out, but I just think long term, we're much better off if we go down that path. And that means, in this regard, I'm not just going to be challenging the other party, I'm going to be challenging some of my own party. But that's all right, I've done that before. When I did what we did a few years ago, long before the union protesters, long before taking on the liberal special interests from Washington, we had to take on our own party's establishment. And we weren't intimidated from them, nor any of the others who took us on along the way. We certainly wouldn't be intimidated from doing what we think is right, to act in the best interest of children and students all across this great country.
We just got a couple of minutes left. You mentioned the bully pulpit. What would be the one or the most important message from the bully pulpit you deliver as president around education and the future of this country?
Well, I think actually two things. One, just overall the importance of it, that it's both a moral but an economic issue. And to that end, on the second point, an economic issue, I would particularly want to tell, if I had the bully pulpit as president, I'd want to say, not just to students, but to parents, to guidance counselors, to teachers and others out there, that we need people who are prepared in all sorts of different careers. And that means we need to lift up our sons and daughters who choose to be welders and machinists and fabricators, IT technicians, nursing assistants, and others, just as much as we choose to lift up those who want to be doctors or lawyers. Because right now, I think there's this misguided perception that if you don't go on to a four-year college or university, that you're not going to have a great career. And I just think that's a huge mistake, because one, it's not true, but two, the evolving number of careers, good paying, decent family supporting careers that we have, more often than not in my state and others across the country, require a two-year associate degree, be it in a technical college or a community college, whatever you want to call it in your state. And there's great careers there. And we talk a lot about student loan debt and problems there, which is very legitimate. That's why I kept tuition down, first time ever 4 years in a row at my state universities, because I think instead of just talking about more federal money in, actually pushing tuition down, or at least keeping it frozen, is more important than just pushing more federal money into it. But in this case, I think, when you look at a lot of young people who've gone into careers after a two-year technical or community college degree, they got less student loan debt, they got out in the workforce sooner, and many of them are making $15,000 to $20,000 more a year than some of their classmates who are out a few years later. And so we need to make sure that every one of our students understand early on, ideally 6th, 7th grade, that there are many great career choices out there. They need to pick, they need to think about what they like, what they're interested in, what they're good at, and what kind of careers are out there, and make choices earlier on in school, so that then they're not just pushed into things and having to choose between, well, you're just going to be in a service industry, or you're going to have to go to a 4-year postgraduate college experience. There's a lot of great careers that we desperately need people to fill right now. And I think that's one of the areas the president, and I said this to President Obama a couple years ago at a meeting of all the governors. I said, Mr. President, this is not a partisan issue. This is not a political question. I asked the president then, unfortunately, he didn't make it the kind of push I've made in my own state, but is we need to make sure that every one of our students understands that there's a great career choice out for them, and they don't all have to do the same thing, but they all have to know that there's different steps for different people to do well in life.
Governor Scott Walker, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Governor.
Great conversation. Appreciate it.